Thank you all for coming, and a particular thanks to Yas for giving us the opportunity to speak today. I know a lot of the Irish lads that have come over are very excited for the talks over the coming days. I think it's particularly exciting coming to Yas as an Irish person, because I think it's about 6 years ago a group of Irish students came over to Yas for the conference. And it ended up turning into a national scandal because some of the students from that cohort were members of our nominally centre-right political party, Fine Gael. And that included the president of its youth wing, Céitinn Walsh. And I think what caused the moral panic was the crime of members of a mainstream Irish political party coming over to meet members of one of your mainstream political parties. But I remember being in class when the newspaper articles and the radio started kind of spouting quite vitriolic abuse at these students. And it was one headline in particular from that time period that kind of stuck in my mind, because I think it sort of betrayed an attitude in maybe our media and political establishment towards those in Ireland with heterodox opinions. And that was in the Irish Times, our largest newspaper and our paper of record, where Cathy Sheridan wrote the article, "Céitinn Walsh should shut up and listen." And I suppose with the political developments in Ireland over the last 6 years, those in Ireland with heterodox opinions, they didn't shut up. So hopefully YAF isn't about to drag another group of impressionable Irish youths through a national scandal. But it was around the same time that I sort of began my work in free speech activism. So today I sort of want to just give a short summary of the kind of developments with speech in Ireland since then. And I think kind of from that article you can kind of ascertain what the sort of attitude is, because there's an incestuous relationship between our political establishment and our media class, where high-ranking members of political parties are often either related to major Irish journalists, or journalists will work for our political parties as political advisors, or media figures will ultimately run for our political parties as candidates. Recently, there was a scandal in Ireland where it came out that there was a seemingly coordinated campaign by media outlets not to publish excerpts of the victim impact statement of the boyfriend of one of the most high-profile murder victims in Ireland in my lifetime. And journalist Kitty Holland claimed that the reason that this decision was taken by many of our media outlets was because, quote, "I think elements of it was not good. There were incitements to hatred. That's why the media left out aspects of them." So our media don't really view their role as to report on the news objectively or tell the Irish people what's happening. They kind of view their role as to selectively and moralistically choose what the Irish are capable of hearing, and to leave out what might be disturbing to dominant narratives in Ireland. And I think what cements this dynamic between our political parties and our media is that the overwhelming majority of our media is either entirely dependent on state funding, as is the case with our national broadcaster, or partially reliant on financial support from the Irish government or the European Union. And the state has a marked difference in how it treats independent media outlets to fully dependent outlets. For example, last year the Irish police sought a secret court order to compel Twitter or X to hand over private messages, IP addresses, subscriber details and other data from the independent media outlet Gript. And the Irish state didn't inform Gript of that, but thankfully X did. At one of these protests in particular that Gript were covering, one of their journalists, Fatima Gunning, and a member of the Irish Press Council, was pepper sprayed by police despite having informed them that she was a journalist there to cover the protests. And there was no condemnation from other media outlets, and there was no condemnation or concern raised by members of our government parties. And I think it's in this context of having such a poor media environment that makes the sort of fear-mongering over and calls for legislation over misinformation and disinformation particularly concerning. Only last week there was a stabbing in Dublin of a member of our police force, Garda Síochána, and instantly the rumour started spreading that it was a migrant that had carried out the attack, and that it was an Islamist attack. And the media came out in full force saying that this was misinformation, disinformation, and that was a problem that needed to be combated, until the actual video of the attack came out where the individual was actually shouting Islamist slogans during the attack, as Irish people do. But as of now, that legislation is yet to materialise, and the most recent attempt in Ireland domestically to restrict freedom of speech through the law was through the hate speech bill. So the bill sought to criminalise both hateful expression and the possession of hateful materials, based on what we sort of believed was kind of gross speculation. The government claimed that there were protections within the bill for freedom of speech, but that would have demanded that the suspect prove that he had that material for genuine academic reasons or genuine artistic reasons. The government also made the argument that the bill wouldn't limit freedom of speech because freedom of speech was protected in our constitution and by the European Union. But that's kind of a strange claim because Ireland does actually have a history of censorship and book bans being permissible under the constitution. And I suppose what really kind of rang the bell for us was that the government rejected a proposed amendment to the legislation to include the United Nations definition of freedom of speech. And I think it was what kind of gave the game away was then Senator Pauline O'Reilly, a then member of the governing Green Party, gave a speech on the bill where she said, quote, "That's exactly what we're doing here. We are restricting freedom. Yes, you have your rights, but they are restricted." We were told that the bill wouldn't be politicised, which was, I suppose, a dubious claim given the track record of similar legislation in Britain and in continental Europe, but an even more dubious claim given the comments of Government Member of Parliament, TD Deputy Cathal Crowe. In relation to a minor political party, Deputy Crowe said, quote, if its members believe they have a right to speech, they will have less of a right when to make their statements when we sign up to this, because any form of rallying people or inciting hatred in that regard will be illegal. In other words, Deputy Crowe's understanding of the legislation was that it would be weaponised against his political opponents. And I suppose we were very much concerned by these developments, and I hate to confirm a national stereotype, but we were in the pub. We decided that we would run a campaign against the legislation. And that took the form of, so we targeted key local constituencies of politicians that were involved in producing the legislation with a leafleting and a canvassing campaign. And then we ran public meetings across the country and ultimately a media campaign. And thankfully that campaign was actually successful. We were able to amend the hate speech bill to remove the provisions pertaining to speech. Unfortunately, more recently, the Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, seemed to signal that he wanted to reintroduce the provisions of the bill pertaining to speech. Then he went on to backtrack from that, claiming that the legislation that we already have in place is sufficient, which came as a little bit of a shock to us because the government maintained throughout the past 2 years that the current legislation was insufficient to deal with rising hate. But I suppose the campaign actually alerted us to other areas of kind of growing concern in Ireland with regards to freedom of speech, particularly academic freedom. So in Ireland at the moment, through the Athena Swan programme, academic research funding is tied to ideological commitment. And universities across the country, quite depressingly, are abandoning institutional neutrality in the face of pressure from, albeit quite marginal groups, but quite extreme ones. But at the start of this year, things were actually looking up. University provosts and presidents were beginning to talk about the importance of freedom of speech, of academic freedom. I think even the Taoiseach spoke about the importance of hearing alternative opinions. And it was within this context that we set up Breaking Point to have the discussions and the arguments and the debates about issues and topics with speakers that we found very interesting, but that we felt had been neglected by our national media and our universities. But sort of a bit like clockwork, we went to hold an event in the University College of Dublin on the issue of is Ireland safe? And somewhat ironically, the university cancelled that on safety concerns. So a little bit ironic. But we know from the correspondence between activists and the universities that was published by the activists themselves that the decision was made by the university following a pressure campaign from activists on campus. And kind of a bit upsettingly, in those correspondence, university administrators seem to express some level of sympathy for the motivations of the activists in terms of silencing heterodox opinions. It was sort of like dragged back into free speech samsara. But I think what does give me optimism in this situation is that one thing I've noticed across these years is that restrictions on freedom of speech or academic freedom or the free exchange of ideas in Ireland is actually deeply unpopular with the Irish people. And we knew throughout the campaign that there was a lot of confusion among government backbenchers as to why the government was actually progressing with this legislation. And speaking on the hate speech bill specifically, former Justice Minister Charlie Flanagan said, quote, "I would have more power as a low-ranking member of a vociferous NGO than I would have as a government backbencher. I deeply regret that." So calls for restrictions on freedom of speech in Ireland are not coming from the Irish people. They're barely even coming from our elected representatives. They're coming from a deeply radical NGO class that has managed to carve out 8% of the entire national budget for themselves.
And I think what's kind of most upsetting to me about this deference to the NGO class from the government is that the area where the Irish government does actually exercise sovereignty is increasingly diminishing. Government MEPs have even said that now 70% of all Irish laws are made in Brussels. And while it's true that the culture of speech in Ireland might be a little bit grim at the moment, and that the EU's DSA laws will most impact the freedom of speech of Americans through their implementation via Ireland's Media Commission, Commission Numian, I think what's important is that the EU has at best a very tenuous commitment to the principle of freedom of speech, and at worst is openly hostile to it. When they were asked in the recent trade negotiations between the EU and the US whether there'd been any developments with regards to the Digital Services Act, EU officials said that they would defend their right to regulate. And of course what they meant by that wasn't just the right to regulate the speech of their own citizens, but the right to regulate the speech of individuals worldwide. A recent report by the MCC Brussels found that the EU spends 1/3 more on free speech restrictions and censorship and on narrative control than they do on cancer research. And aside from the DSA, that includes 340 projects and hundreds of external organizations. And while I think that this probably might suggest that there's a very grim future for Europe and for Ireland with regards to freedom of speech, I would say that I am actually quite optimistic about the future of Ireland. I think across the business, arts, literature, music, culture, technology, I think our tiny island has really had an outsized impact. And I think that's why it's quite quite the painful aspect of this for me is that I can see other parts of the world and other countries, including the United States, kind of moving away from quite claustrophobic and regressive ideologies, while our political class seems to be retreating back into them. And this censorious culture is actually impoverishing the island because there's so many really exceptional Irish speakers and Irish thinkers, but many of them are forced to go abroad because the civic culture at home isn't providing space for them. And I think that's depressing because with these people, the future on our island could really look amazing. But we need open discourse and a healthier civic culture to facilitate that, because fundamentally all progress, social, cultural, scientific, it necessitates that. And I think that's why I have a deep admiration for Americans' commitment to the principle of freedom of speech. And it's very heartening for me to see the American administration sending individuals over to discuss these problems with Commission Numian, or that Vice President Vance had actually written to our government to express concern over the state of freedom of speech in Ireland. And I think most Irish people, and I hope most Americans too, are very glad that the relationship between our two countries is so close, that we care so much about each other's human rights. Thank you very much.